Hello, AP Psychology. Happy Thursday. Happy day before your long weekend. So today we are going to do our first set of notes together. And of course, normally if we were in person in school, we would just be doing this, that there would be a Google Slides and I would give you a bit more information as I lectured to you. This is obviously an Edpuzzle, so it's going to be a bit more interactive. So if you've never used Edpuzzle before, which I believe most of you probably have, from time to time the video will stop and there will be questions. So all the information that will be needed for the question will have been gone over in the slide. It goes like slide and then question about the slide. So you can rewatch the video as you go along. If you need to rewatch to get the information a second time, you are welcome to do that. At the end of this video, there will be a brief description of how to do the APA citations. Also, I'm including in this assignment the Google Slides just by themselves if you want them for your reference. So without further ado, here is part 1 of History and Approaches to Psychology notes. You may take these notes however you wish at the moment. I recommend handwriting them. If you would rather type, that is up to you, but I strongly encourage handwritten notes if possible. Here we go. Again, this is the first part of our notes on the history and then later approaches to psychology. So we'll finish these up on Tuesday, which is your next asynchronous day. And then on Wednesday, we meet live and we'll talk about what worked and didn't work for you personally for notes. So what is psychology? I asked you all last week to come up with a personal definition of what psychology is. And most of you were totally spot on with this exact definition pretty much. Psychology is a scientific study of behavior and mental processes. Behavior is what is on the outside, what is observable. Mental processes are what is on the inside, what is not observable. Psychology, the word itself, comes from the Greek word psyche, meaning mind, and ology, meaning the study of something. So bio, meaning life, ology, study of. Biology is the study of life. So as we talked about with your homework questions yesterday, the major issue in psychology is the nature versus nurture debate. That is how much of our behavior and mental processes are a result of our genetics and our physiology, and how much is a result of our environment and interactions with others. So ultimately, the goal of psychology is to be able to describe why people think, act, and feel the way they do. Now, psychologists, for the most part, agree that nurture works on what nature endows, meaning that you're genetically predisposed to act, think, feel certain ways, and nature impacts how those traits come out or not. You've probably heard of the scientific method before in your other science classes. So psychology is a science, and science is based on objective, verifiable evidence obtained using the scientific method, which is on the right here. So we always start with a hypothesis, or if you will, an educated guess that is based on theory. Then we go through experiments or procedures and gather data and analyze that data to find conclusions. And from that those conclusions, we are able to gather more information to create new hypotheses. So before we move on, just a note on pseudopsychology. So pseudopsychology is, or any field that attempts to explain human behavior based on unscientific information. So things like palm reading, astrology. I'm a big fan of astrology. You'll hear me talk about it all year long, but it is not real psychology. Why does this matter? Well, when people believe in these pseudo-scientific or pseudo-psychological theories, they miss out on real psychological insights, which are more helpful and interesting and accurate. It also can produce a lot of fraud, like people that try to take advantage of others by promising them bogus analyses of behavior, which really are more for entertainment than anything else. So just a quick note on that. So here's the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist, because while they're related, they are not the same thing. A psychiatrist is a medical doctor, somebody who has gone to medical school and is authorized to prescribe medication. You cannot get medication from a psychologist. A psychologist is a person who likely also did go to graduate school but didn't go to medical school. They are not authorized to prescribe medicine and focus more on psychotherapy or talk therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy, and we will talk about what all those types of therapy are when we get to our last unit on disorders and therapy, which is probably the most interesting unit, but they're all interesting. Psychology has its roots in a lot of ancient thinking. Now, Asian and African cultures had ideas about psychology centuries before Europeans did. However, yes, Europeans did get all the credit for Western psychology. Notably, it came out of ancient Greek and Roman thought. So it's an interesting thing to think about what the world would have been like, or what this discipline would have been like if it had developed differently in history. So for hundreds of years, Europeans really clung to this idea of the mind being something that is beyond human comprehension. Like God, you can't ultimately ever completely understand it. So psychology was kind of more of a philosophical, nebulous idea, really up until the 17th century, when the French philosopher René Descartes argued that human sensations and behaviors were based on activity in the nervous system. So, and you all know what the nervous system is. For a lot of people at the time, that was like, oh, don't say that. So psychology didn't really become a science until the late 1800s. And that's because the start of psychology can be attributed to the founding of a psychological laboratory at the University of Leipzig in Germany by Wilhelm Wundt. That's how you say that name, Wilhelm Wundt, because German. They pronounce their W's like V's, and their V's like F's. But anyway, moving on. So Wilhelm Wundt, or Wundt, if you will, he was the first to say that he was a psychologist. And his method of thinking was called structuralism. Wilhelm Wundt did not come up with that name himself. His student, E.B. Titchener, developed that from his ideas. Wundt never himself said he was a structuralist, but he was, because that was his idea. So what is structuralism? The central idea of structuralism, and just a note, this is not a current school of thought in psychology. This is early stuff. So structuralism, think Wundt and Titchener, the German guys. So they wanted to uncover the basic structures that make up the mind and looking for the elements of conscious experience. Structuralism relied on introspection. If something is intro, it means within. So that refers to one's reporting of their own conscious mental experiences. So of course, there's probably some strengths and weaknesses to that. So I'm going to ask you for those now. Of course, you probably thought of some drawbacks to structuralism, and like many other psychological thinkers of the time. So a lot of people thought that introspection was unreliable, including this guy here, William James, the first American psychologist that believed that psychology should look at function or purpose and not just structure. Functionalism emphasizes the functions of consciousness and the ways that consciousness helps people adapt to their environment. So what is the purpose? James thought that psychology should explain how people adapt or fail to adapt at everyday life outside the laboratory, because one of James's criticisms of structuralism is that it wasn't being studied in the real world. It wasn't being applied to situations that people would actually be in rather than in just a controlled environment in a laboratory. So again, James criticized structuralism because of its reliance on laboratory research. Not to say laboratory research isn't good, but of course there are different implications of what happens in a lab versus what happens in the real world. James wanted to see how people function in everyday life, not just in these contrived situations that are controlled by a scientist in a lab. He also believed that mental processes were more like a stream of consciousness, constantly changing and evolving and moving rather than just staying the same, like Wundt and the structuralists often did. The last thing we're going to talk about today is Gestalt psychology. And Gestalt psychology also grew out of functionalism, and it opposed structuralism. So instead of looking at the individual components of consciousness, it wanted to examine the whole. And so it looked how the brain works by studying perception and perceptual thinking. An example of that would be looking at a person's face. So when you look at somebody, you're not thinking eye, nose, mouth. You're just seeing a face. And this is an example of Gestalt psychology. You likely first didn't notice all the individual letters that made up this image. The first thing that you saw was likely the elephant, but maybe I'm wrong. Okay guys, so after this video is over, you are going to be redirected to your tutorial on APA citations. Enjoy.